Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone who's here right now. Thank you for taking the time to attend our webinar. Again, this is the Focus on Geothermal webinar, a partnership between ThinkGeoEnergy and Enerchange. I am Carlo Cariaga from ThinkGeoEnergy, and for our webinar today, we have the pleasure of featuring the HotRock Geothermal Research Consortium. This is based in the Bureau of Economic Geology at the University of Texas. It is a research group that aims to accelerate the deployment of geothermal generation. In addition to expertise on conventional hydrothermal systems, HotRock is a bit more focused on in the forefront of the dry rock geothermal anywhere revolution. Today we have the pleasure of having two speakers, each of which can definitely hold their own, but today we are forcing them to share the stage. Up first, we have Dr. Ken Wisian, who has had a very interesting career. He's a retired U.S. Air Force Major General, currently the current Associate Director for the Bureau of Economic Geology. He holds a PhD in geophysics and focuses on geothermal systems, modeling, instrumentation, and data analysis. Our second speaker is Dr. Malcolm Ross. He is a man who has been known by many interesting titles throughout the years. He's involved in a lot of different facets of geothermal, chiefly in education, but he's also in research and innovation in a lot of other areas. He holds a PhD in geology, currently teaches at Rice University and also at the University of Texas. And with that, I give the floor to Dr. Ken Wisian.
All right. Thank you, Carlo. Welcome, everybody. Thanks for attending. And we'll launch right in with an overview of what we're doing here at the Bureau of Economic Geology and focus on some of our recent work. So let me change that. Okay, so again, I'll be leading off. Malcolm will talk in detail about some of our more recent work, but I'll kind of give an overview of where we are at the moment. So first, for those that aren't familiar with us, the Bureau of Economic Geology is both a soft money research organization and the State Geologic Survey of Texas. We focus on applied, very applied research, and one of our most successful models is bringing industry frenemies together, pooling resources and solving common problems. And that's the driver behind our newest of 13 consortiums here at the Bureau, the HotRock Consortium. Our unit is part of the Jackson School of Geoscience. It's the largest and one of the top rated geoscience programs in the nation. And we ourselves are about a $30 million a year operation. We're over 100 years old. We're the second largest research organization at the University of Texas at Austin, with about 150 or more people, depending on how many graduate students and postdocs we have at any one time. We're very diverse with both about a 40% non-US born scientist composition and 1/3 female also. I mentioned we're the State Geologic Survey of Texas, but don't think we only work Texas. We work projects all over the world, Europe, Asia, South America, and have multiple works ongoing, but we're always looking to expand our international work too. Okay, briefly, as Carlo mentioned, we work all areas of geothermal, but we have kind of a focus because of where we are on the newer dry rock systems. So I just want to differentiate between conventional geothermal, which is basically the world's entire installed base of electricity production, where you're mining a natural hot water or steam system in the ground for its energy, versus geothermal anywhere, unconventional. You could break it down into other terms, AGS, EGS, closed loop. The naming kind of is still kind of fuzzy, but the point being that you're extracting the heat from the rock using your own artificial system. And that's where there's more development going on in Texas right now and where we are focused. But I'll also throw in something in between there, which is geopressured reservoirs. And we have a significant resource of that along the Gulf Coast of the US and at other places in the world. That's very low-hanging fruit that's untapped pretty much at this time. The Bureau has been involved in geothermal energy research since the initial boom in the US back in the 70s and 80s, with a lot of very fundamental results and reports that I keep within arm reach and still use on a weekly basis. It's very sound initial science. And of course, nowadays we're building upon that substantially. Our consortium is the newest consortium we have here. It's called HotRock. And as you've already gathered, it's bringing together business entities that are interested in geothermal, that are doing geothermal, that want to advance it, pooling resources, and working with us to set research direction that solves near-term problems for industry. Our scope is broad, and in fact, there's far more interesting and necessary problems to work on than there are people in what is a relatively small academic field of geothermal energy. So we have our first consortium member meeting coming up on 21st and 22nd of March, and we will be working with our members to set our research direction for the foreseeable future in that. And by the way, if anyone's interested in that, please contact me. My contact information is at the beginning and end of this slideshow. Our team, as it stands right now, is strong and growing with a very diverse set of backgrounds in petrology, in rock physics, in temperature measurement, engineering, the economic analysis, a very broad reach. And again, that's part of why we need to focus down on what are the top priorities of research in that regard. This is our initial laydown of our strengths, but as you can see, there's quite a bit of overlap in these different things. We've been doing a lot of work recently on resource evaluation and assessment, and Malcolm will talk more about that. We have some excellent ongoing work on subsurface engineering, such as temperature control while drilling, real-time assessment of faults and fractures while drilling. My particular area is temperature measurement and analysis. We're not only focused on electricity generation, as you'll again hear in a little bit. Direct use is gaining in recognition of its value in the US, catching up with other areas in the world that are already well into direct use. The techno-economic analysis is a very strong area growing that Malcolm is co-leading the development and expansion of the GeoFires system of techno-economic analysis. And of course, as in much of science now, there's a lot of big data problems. In our case, well data, bottom hole temperatures and such, and the application of machine learning to these big data problems is integral to almost everything that happens nowadays. Our consortium has its founding membership here. We're looking to expand that this year, but our founding members are SLB, Shell, and Chesapeake Energy, along with the Environmental Defense Fund as what is essentially an ex officio member. So that's our starting membership, our founding members. But our resources are not just our own research group and the members. We draw and can draw on a wide range of expertise and experience across the Bureau and beyond the Bureau and outside the university as necessary. But in particular, our induced seismicity research, our life cycle analysis research, sensor development, carbon sequestration, those groups in particular have a strong overlap with what we do, and we can draw on their expertise as needed. And the Bureau has extensive background in managing, again, not just our own, but multi-university consortiums of, millions of dollars per year over decades of time, and coordinating up to 30 universities in major projects. So we can also act as a lead in that case. We also have been working closely with Project Interspace, which hopefully you have become familiar with. They're now the largest private organization working to advance geothermal. A lot of work with, obviously, Department of Energy, Department of Defense, not shown here, but the U.S. Geologic Survey and such, our own university lands organization, which has the rights to large chunks of land in the western part of the state. Our recent work is broad, as I already mentioned, but let me start off with pointing out over here the Future of Geothermal in Texas report. This is a free download. The link is here, or you can just Google the title and maybe Mitchell Foundation or Energy Institute, you'll get right to it. It's several hundred pages, it's exhaustive, but I assure you it has a very well done executive summary, which is where I would start. But it's not just the engineering and the geology, it's policy, it's the economics, it's environmental impact, it's law and such. So a very exhaustive, medium high level review of all things geothermal for the future of Texas. So I would start there. In addition, we won't have time to get into this during the talk, but maybe in Q&A, but a lot of work with Department of Defense. As Carlo mentioned, I'm a retired general. Myself and others leaned on the Department of Defense for several years to look at geothermal, and they have jumped in big starting last year with now projects at at least 8 bases, 3 of which are in Texas, advancing geothermal. Militaries in general are a perfect early adopter of this dry rock geothermal anywhere movement. Exploration and resource assessment. We have both a USGS state map project to map the temperatures in Texas, but we're also doing much deeper dives on a county level. There's about 250 counties in Texas, so that gives you an idea of the scale. And we're finishing up a detailed report, which Malcolm will talk about in a minute. Also working with the International Heat Flow Commission through Project Interspace to harmonize data and establish the process for doing that for a worldwide project that Interspace is leading. Again, Malcolm will talk about GeoFires X version 3. It's moving along quite well. I'm not sure I'm up to date on that one. I mentioned the heat management. Rock thermal properties, one of our PIs has an extensive high temperature, high pressure rock physics lab. We're adding to that with setting up thermal conductivity and diffusivity measurement right now, and well logging. Our induced seismicity is also a big factor here. So we have been the induced seismicity monitor for Texas for quite some time now. We're transferring that knowledge and actively monitoring a multi-year test drilling, a geothermal test drilling project in Texas at this point. Okay, getting close to wrapping, but our facilities, besides our experience and knowledge, one of the world's largest core and well log repositories, and all the associated labs you could think of for analyzing rock core in that regard. I'm going to skip over some of the detailed bottom hole temperature measurement work, but we can come back to that in Q&A if necessary, if desired. But the membership benefits for our consortium, again, leveraging the investment quite a bit, not just the membership investment, but also the other research fundings that we have, complement what we do there, helping accelerate what companies are interested, working as essentially a deeper back shop for them, working on teams for the major project calls that are coming out now and will probably accelerate next year, where you need both academia and operators on a team for a successful bid on a project. And of course, one of the less tangible things, the geothermal field is a small area of academia. Very few universities have strong programs in this. one of the strong benefits is for industry to essentially tap into our production of bachelor's, master's, and PhD people with deep geothermal knowledge. So that's another area where our members kind of get to try out our pipeline of students as we go forward. So that's a real quick overview of the HotRock Consortium. Let me turn it over to Malcolm now to go into more detail on some of our recent work.
Thanks for that, Ken. So far, that's very impressive. I mean, well, from what I've seen so far, you're doing so much at the consortium. But just let me interrupt this for a while, just to let our audience know that you can ask questions. There's a question box right at the panel of GoToWebinar, and you can just type in the questions there, and we'll get to those after Malcolm has presented his part of the presentation. So now I turn it over to you, Malcolm.
Yeah, thank you, Carlo, and Ken, thank you for the excellent introduction. Why don't we go to the first slide here as we make a deep dive into one project of many that we are involved with and many more that we'd like to do in the HotRock. But this is just an example of one style of project we might do. And this is focused on Presidio County, Texas. You can see the inset map. Presidio County is in the far western part of Texas, in the deserts of far western Texas. It's down there on the border with Mexico. In fact, the western border is the Rio Grande, which is the international boundary between Mexico and the US. You can see some statistics about the county. It's about 10,000 square kilometers or so. You will note that the population is only just slightly over 6,100 people. That makes the population density about 2 people per square mile, or 0.8 per square kilometer. And just for a sense of just how few people that is, Houston has a density of 2,700. Australia, with its broad expanses of dry land, you know, you have mental image of Australia, that's a density of 3.35. So Presidio is almost half of that. So you can see there are 2 main towns, Marfa in the northeast and Presidio in the southwest, more or less, and some national parks and state parks, which have some bearing in consideration when you start talking about where you might locate a project. So let's go to the next slide. This is an attempt to try to identify some of the positives and negatives of that. So from that, you can draw the view that there is vast and inexpensive land available. So there is a good educational infrastructure there. The University of Texas system has branches out there in that area that are quite involved. The county actually, for a rural county, they have a very strong renewable energy focus. So they have a solar and a molten salt battery system, which I will touch on at the end. Given its border with Mexico, it has a strong international trade and transportation infrastructure, and that is expanding currently with a new rail line going in and new bridges and so on. So actually, for opportunities in this county, you might be looking west rather than east. And given the somewhat difficult situation there, there's a lot of federal and state incentives, which I will also mention at the end of the talk. And the emergence of a hipster community in Marfa, I'm not sure how that exactly plays into the positive, but anyways, that's considered a positive. Population density, however, is also a negative because there's very low power demand needs. There's not a lot of infrastructure. There's not a lot of industry that would demand the geothermal resources. There's also a perception of the region as not having good education, having crime, low infrastructure. Those are sort of the non-technical things that we have to, perceptions we need to break. With a very small indigenous entrepreneurship effort and a very limited water supply. So these are things that all have to play into the design of what we do. So our strategy here is to, of course, look at the energy system and how and where it might make sense to do renewable energy projects, in particular geothermal, and how to play to the infrastructure strength in the county, also the agricultural strength to do things like food processing, manufacturing, and increase tourism. Next slide, please. So to dig in now, we're starting to go deep, literally. This is a summary of the stratigraphy. There's really two regions, which I'll discuss in just a minute, what we call the border region and the interior region. You can see there's a lack of detail here. We've got basically a tertiary, a Paleozoic, Mesozoic, and a Precambrian stratigraphy. That's because there is no oil and gas in this county. They kind of got the short end of the stick when it comes to oil and gas in West Texas. You go across the border to Jeff Davis or Brewster counties, you start running into the Permian Basin and a prolific region. But as a consequence, there's just not a lot of really good information and not a lot of measured section, not a lot of core and detail. But this is what we came up with, and you can see the border region basement is at about 8,000 feet, and it is about 150 C into the shallow basement at about 8,200 feet. The interior region basement is at 19,000 feet, and that 150 C sort of benchmark is at 15,000 feet. So the gradients, the thermal gradients here are substantially different, and I will touch on that. But it's worth noting that the tertiary is actually an igneous, mostly igneous section with some drift on top. But that volcanism comes from more related to the geology to the west of Texas into New Mexico and Arizona. It's more of the Basin and Range, Colorado Plateau kind of geology than the sort of rest of Texas. So next slide, please. A couple of cross sections here. They both start up in Marfa, so up in the northwest corner of the county, and go into Mexico. A and A prime to B and B prime. Let's look at those cross sections, please, Ken. Here is A to A prime. So Mexico is to the right in this case, and I've labeled where the warm and hot regions are, that border high gradient region with the shallower basement and the deeper basement as you get into up towards Marfa and the lower heat flow. Very similar gradient, very similar profile for the B profile. So Ken, if you would, please. You can see a very similar sort of depths and configuration here, and the significant change, especially in the tertiary stratigraphy, indicating a deeper basement kind of history for that part of the region. So that's a sort of a two-dimensional picture, the vertical dimension. Let's go to the next map and talk about the temperature measurements. So this is in what we call the warm region, that interior region. And this is a compilation of all the wells we could find in that region. And we've done corrections using Ken's expertise to the bottom hole temperatures. And you can see what the heat flow and the gradient is for this region. You can see it's about 30 degrees C per kilometer, pretty average for the world, and actually most of Texas is around this number, maybe less. And then you can see the various breaks for the tertiary. The bottom of the tertiary, base of the tertiary is about 1,500 meters. The bottom of the Paleozoic is about 6,000, and then down into the basement at 8,400. So that's the sort of the warm region. Let's look at the gradients for the next one. This is now in that border region. Again, a limited data set and having to extrapolate to some of those deeper temperatures, but you can see the gradient is 50% or more higher there, averaging almost 50 and even above 50 in the Paleozoic section, more or less. So I think my comment is, if you were to go do geothermal in Texas, this county is probably the first place you'd go, especially this hot region, this border area, at least from a thermal gradient temperature point of view. There are other parts of Texas that have high gradients, but they're complicated by a much more complicated geopressures system and stratigraphy and a lot of, but a lot more data because there's a lot of oil and gas there, and that complicates the story as well. Next one, please. Here is a map of the data. You can see in the southeast region, we've got almost no data. We call that the Big Bend region, and there's maybe only 2 wells in that whole region. But you can see that sort of western border region stands out distinctively as a substantially different thermal regime. Next slide, please. This is a contour view of that. And you can see the temperatures get quite hot. We have hot springs that represent a real hydrothermal style system with some fractures bringing up some hot water from very deep depths. But it's real sort of localized, but the overall system is quite hot. Next one. And this is how we've broken the regions up. So the dark red is what we call the hot or the border region. The pink is the warm interior region, and then Big Bend is sort of the unknown region. It's actually interesting, that line that borders the warm and Big Bend region is actually the suture between Laurentia and Gondwana for the geology people in the room. So the basement is of substantially different age and character, and I think we're going to find Big Bend region is not going to be a very favorable target in general. Next slide, please. So we've done a heat and place assessment for the entire county using a heat and place assessment tool that's available within GeoFires, and we've done summaries for all 3 of those regions as best we could. You can see what the input temperatures and reservoir porosities are like, and what the kind of outputs are that you get. But there's a lot of uncertainty here. So next slide, please. And you can see the orange highlights of high degrees of uncertainty. You can see the ranges for the formation tops are variable. The porosity has a broad range. And so this lends itself to Monte Carlo analysis. So next slide is a Monte Carlo input. So you can see where it says input. We've done porosity over a triangular distribution between 6 and 20. The reservoir thickness is between 1/4 and 1. The reservoir temperatures vary between 246 and 286. Rejection temperatures vary based upon the seasons, etc. For 2,500 iterations, we're going to track heat and electricity. So let's go to the next slide. And this is what the distribution looks like for only one of the things we are tracking for the 2,500 iterations. You can see we get a kind of a Gaussian distribution with a median around 100. So that sort of gives us some statistical validity to the assumption that for this particular scenario, we get about 100 megawatts per unit area, which is a kilometer. Now, you can't produce all of that, but that's the kind of energy density that we see. Next one. And these are the Monte Carlo simulation results for those iterations. I just want to draw your attention to the figures at the bottom that indicate that the heat production and electricity production goes up from the tertiary to the Paleozoic to the basement. That's no surprise. There's more heat there. But the Paleozoic midsection is actually a pretty good target. You don't necessarily have to get into basement to get some really good energy production numbers. So let's move on to the next one. Yeah, so that was heat, and then this is electricity. I won't dig into the tables for you here, but same story. You know, of course, the electricity is derived from the heat. But when we talk about electricity, we should be looking at the infrastructure. So here's a map of the transmission infrastructure in Presidio County. You can see there's one transmission line. It's a 69 megawatt transmission line. It goes basically from Marfa to Presidio, period. You will notice there's photovoltaics and batteries down by in the southwest corner by the town of Presidio. that's how they supplement the power that they get from MARFA. But if you were to put a power plant in the hot region in the southwest, you're going to have to build transmission unless you consume that energy locally, sort of behind the meter. Next one, please. So here are some geofire scenarios that we built. I would mention that if you're interested in geofires, go to tinyurl.com/geofires, and you will get access to a web-based version of geofires. You can also download the source code for both it and the heat and place calculation tool. All that information is at that URL. But what you'll see, we did 4 scenarios for power generation in Presidio County. You can see them listed below. 2 are EGS, so fracking-based sort of stimulation scenarios, and 2 are AGS, so that closed loop thing that Ken was talking about. And you can see the predicted electricity production, the LCOE for that, the NPV, IRR, etc. for those projects, the CapEx, OpEx. This is all generated by geofires. What I will point out to you is that the price that people are paying for electricity in Presidio County is 15 cents per kilowatt hour. So the LCOE of 12 is, yeah, that's really probably too close to make a profit. So 10, 11, yeah, those are pretty marginal for making a profit there. And that's reflected in the NPV. You can see even the NPV is negative for the one EGS project, meaning it never makes money. And that's why the IRR is low and so on. So out of geofires, we've sort of draw some conclusions about what the available electricity production looks like and the finances of it. Let's go to the next slide, and this is about direct use. So Ken, next slide, please. Oh yeah, this is geofires inputs and outputs. I'm not going to spend time on this, but we'll move forward. You see, you put in some things like temperature depths and gradients and economic models and power plant types, and then it produces things like LCOE, break-even price, etc. So this is a whole variety of direct use things you can do. I don't think snow melting is a particular problem in Presidio County, but the agri-industry stuff, for example, looks very interesting. Greenhouses, aquaculture, food drying. So you might be bringing produce in from Mexico and then drying it and preparing it for the markets in the US, for example, or growing high value crops, or adding to the protein base by doing aquaculture, etc. So maybe direct use makes more sense here rather than trying to do electricity to the grid. Next one, please. And so that's 4 more scenarios. Geofires has the capability to do a variety of these kinds of scenarios. You see the agri-processing scenario, greenhouse scenario. There's a direct air capture of CO2 using geothermal energy model here. Here's an absorption chiller. So for example, if you're going to do a data center and the only thing that you're sending out on the grid, not grid, on the internet is bits and bytes through a fiber optic cable, that's a whole lot different than building a transmission line. And again, here's the NPV, IRR, payback periods, depths, temperatures, lots of good information coming out of geofires that will support the county in soliciting businesses and businesses making decisions about investing in projects in the county, and not just energy transmission, electricity transmission projects. You can see some substantially good NPVs on some of this stuff. You'll notice that the NPV for greenhouses and CO2 are negative, but the point of these things is not to make a profit in the energy production. You're feeding your energy into your profit-making engine. So in greenhouses, it's your crops and what you sell. So if you're losing money a little bit on the energy, that's okay, because you're making money on the sale of your products. And then geothermally driven CO2 is not a profit game, except if you talk about the energy subsidies that you get for doing that, tax benefits and so on. So that's, again, you're never going to make money doing that. It's only viable if you're getting paid to sequester, for example, or feed the CO2 across the way into the oil fields of the Permian Basin. So here's GeoFire's inputs. Again, this is an electricity example for an EGS style thing. I won't go into any of the details here, but Ken, go ahead and loop through these so we can get to some questions. You know, some inputs and some outputs. This one is a joint use, so it actually is giving you both the electricity and heat. So it's a combined heat and power style project. So this is a map again of our areas, hot, warm, and the Big Bend areas. But what I've superimposed on here in the Hatcher zone is an economic development zone. I believe it's a state level economic development zone, where if you develop in this zone, you will get substantial subsidies and benefits to your project. And notice at least half of the red zone, the hot zone, is in an economic development zone. That should be an incentive to go do projects in that area. And that economic development zone is independent of the Inflation Reduction Act, of the Build Back Better infrastructure bill, which will also all apply in this area. So I think, oh yeah, here's one more example. This is Presidio. And where you've got that thing that says Bob, that's what they call the big old battery. That's the sulfur battery. So that whole green area is owned by the county. And I've just drawn in a hypothetical 1 hectare geothermal plant at the surface. And then because a lot of our scenarios include horizontal drilling, up to 6 kilometers of horizontal drilling, I wanted to draw out for you what that looks like geographically. So that line is 6.2 kilometers long. If you're extracting heat from the subsurface along that line, okay, for the first third of it, you're within the county. And at the very last of it, you're in the county. But for a big portion of that, you're in someone else's land. And what's unusual about Texas is that the people who own the surface rights own the heat, not the subsurface rights. So if you were to try to permit this, you need to interact with the people who own the property at the surface along this line. So that makes for a slightly different permitting story, I think. But I just wanted to give you a feel for what a project in this area might look like in terms of footprint. And it could be co-located with the battery and the solar to provide supplemental energy, fill-in energy when those things aren't working. So I'll stop there. Carlo, I'll turn it over to you, and I'd be glad to take any questions about the techno-economics or anything else.
Thank you, Ken and Malcolm. I imagine we've barely touched the surface of what the consortium is actually working on. But I love that we're seeing the approach of geothermal development, where it doesn't stop when power generation is not feasible. Like we're looking into ways to make it profitable, looking just beyond power generation. And now questions are coming in, but before we go to the more highly technical ones, this is very timely. Today we are celebrating the International Women's Day. And this is a great day to celebrate the value that women bring to our lives and to our society, but also continuing to recognize that the struggle for gender equality is still ongoing. So as parts of this consortium and as parts of the Bureau, can you provide some insights on the importance of fostering this type of diversity and having an inclusive environment, and how does this enhance the output of the group? And perhaps can you give us some numbers on how diverse is the Bureau or your team?
I'll take that. I think Ken already mentioned it. The Bureau of Economic Geology is a highly technical organization and has a third women in the scientific staff, 40% international, another form of diversity that is important. And I'll make some personal remarks around this. I will first say that I have a vested interest in gender equality in this area, in geosciences in general. My daughter is just graduated with an advanced degree in geology, and she's out there trying to find work. So I'm looking to bolster that. So that's sort of my dog in the fight. I guess I just called my daughter a dog, but anyways, so I just wanted to be transparent about that. But one of the things that I'm proud of to be a part of in geothermal, I'll start with the WING organization. That's the Women in Geothermal. And the fact that there's even an organization focused on that in the geothermal world, I think is a good thing. I'm a WING man. That's a member of the WING organization that is supportive of this topic. The organization is quite large. I encourage you to go to womeningeothermal.org. If you're interested in joining and understanding what they do. One of the things they do is a survey. And every year or every couple of years, they report on how we're doing in the geothermal industry. I'm sad to report that we're not at 50%, nowhere near 50%. The last report I heard, I seem to recall it was somewhere around 30% of the overall employment in the space was women. And that number was rising, as I recall, and that number was better than oil and gas. So at least we're better than sort of an equivalent discipline and subject matter employment space. But there is certainly a need to improve that. I will, however, also call out the fact that a substantial amount of the leadership in geothermal is women. And I will shout out to, for example, Lauren Boyd, who is the head of the Geothermal Technology Office at the National Department of Energy here. That sort of sets the course for geothermal in the federal government, or at least not the Department of Defense, but a lot of the federal government and the Department of Energy. Anyway, shout out to Amanda Kolker, who heads the National Renewable Energy Geothermal team. Shout out to Ann Robertson Tate, who is the CEO of Geothermex, Schlumberger, one of Schlumberger's geothermal efforts. Shout out to Cindy Taff, who's the CEO of Sage. Shout out to Kristen Marcia, Deep Earth Energy CEO, startup leader. Sarah Jewett, Vice President for Fervo. If we're going to grow the gender equality, we need leaders who are aware of it and who are actively working towards it, and that's just a few of them. However, the limiting factor is the pipeline of people coming in. Now, the professionals coming in, they come in at choice, but the other pipeline is the students. Ken and I teach geothermal energy at University of Texas. I can provide just some data on our classes. When we taught the class in 2022, we had better than 50% membership of the class as female. When we taught it last year, it was over 40%. So the pipeline, I would like to think, is going to be suitable for improving those numbers. I will also mention I teach the course at Rice University, and the story isn't all good. There was only 15% of that class were women. So there's certainly room to grow and improve here, but I'm at least proud to say that I'm part of a community that's trying to get better at this. So I said a lot there, Ken.
I'll just quickly throw in one other name, Merritt Bromer, who's the head of the International Geothermal Association.
Great. Sorry, Merritt.
I mean, if Ken hadn't mentioned that, I would. Yeah. But I think it's also very important to highlight all these women who are heading geothermal research institutes, companies that serve as models, perhaps for other women who would want to get into this industry, and that there's a very good chance for success here for them. Okay, let's move on to the other questions, perhaps to the more obvious ones. Texas being an oil and gas country, are you also looking at how to repurpose oil and gas wells for geothermal?
I'll start in on that. Yes, that is an active area of interest, and I expect that repurposing of existing wells or fields, maybe more broadly, will be a priority for our consortium members. There is intense interest in it. We get pinged on a fairly regular basis asking questions related to that. You know, and it's an interesting question. You know, with the advances in drilling, is it better to enter an old well and maybe recondition it, or deal with the very narrow bottom section of a well, which might be a limiting factor? Or is it better to drill a brand new well that fits your needs, but in an existing field where you at least know the geology? So I think it's a very interesting question, and one of the top priorities probably for research and experimentation.
I'll add to that. I think it's going to be very challenging, given all the things that Ken just mentioned, to do grid power electricity from repurposed oil and gas wells. The heat is simply not there, the flow rates aren't there, etc. However, the direct use, for example, in a greenhouse, you don't want really hot water. You're going to kill your plants if you get too hot, right? So medium temperatures, 100 degrees C maybe or less, is perfectly good for a greenhouse, or for dry cleaning, or for a lot of other sort of uses of geothermal. Repurposing oil and gas wells to do that sort of work may make a lot of sense, because they generally are lower temperature, lower flow rate, etc. So I think people looking to do grid power from repurposed wells are going to struggle.
I'll also add that energy storage might be a very good use too. Texas is the country's leading producer of wind-based electricity, and it's roughly in the same region as oil and gas wells. So the ability to store excess energy that right now is sold for zero and then produce it later could really do a lot towards leveling out the intermittency of wind and solar.
Okay, thank you for that. We have a lot of questions, so I'll try to group them together just to we have several questions all at once. Specific to that report you did for Presidio County, I imagine this is an effort that you would like to replicate as well for other counties. What is this kind of data that you're going to need to be able to do this sort of thing as well?
I'll start on that. Malcolm can chime in, but there's never enough data. So everything we can get. Of course, the keys are temperatures, which is your only actual direct measurement of the resource, and lithology. So where there's been a lot of oil and gas drilling, there's usually reasonably good amounts of data of what you're interested in. Where there hasn't been, then you're working on a thin edge of knowledge, and perhaps you'll need to do some slim hole or gradient surveys or other things to robust out your knowledge. But basically, whatever you can get is helpful. And in one of our studies for a military base on the south side of Houston, old seismic lines were a key factor there, along with the fact that the site was between two old oil and gas fields. But the seismic lines to see if our intended drilling site was likely to encounter any fault that might bleed off the fluid. So it's a wide variety. Malcolm, what would you add?
I would add that indeed, this is only our first county level assessment. The counties are lining up behind Presidio for us to do similar analyses. And yes, it's going to be difficult. It's going to have different degrees of difficulty based upon how much data there is. I will also point out that a thing that we did at the Bureau recently was commission a study of just a couple of counties looking at the current assessment of published assessment of what the gradients and bottom hole temperatures might be compared to re-looking at the data with a new eye. New data has come in since the assessment was done. The classic assessment, of course, is the SMU national assessment, and what we found was a general pattern of underestimation of the bottom hole temperatures. Am I right in saying it was 15 to 20% low for those counties? Ken, is that the right number?
That's in the ballpark. It varies, but yeah, it probably averages about 15% higher than we had appreciated with the SMU maps. And a lot of that was based on the vast amount of drilling in the last decade that added BHTs to the data, along with more refined lithology study too.
And Ken's expertise at improving the bottom hole temperature estimate algorithm. Don't let him be too modest.
These next questions are more specific to that geofires model. Can it also be used to consider additional revenue streams such as lithium recovery and extraction? And can it also be used to incorporate financial incentives like tax breaks or grants?
Yes, 100% yes. I've done work on the lithium modeling. We use this concept called add-ons, and you can have as many as 3 add-ons. Basically, you just specify the how much heat or electricity you need and the revenue model, and it will calculate for you for those additional add-ons what's the value of that add-on, and then it will add it into the project NPV, IRR, et cetera, and tell you what the bottom line is for your project for those add-ons. And the add-on can be anything you want, but I used it in particular and designed it for lithium. Was there a second part of your question that I missed?
About financial incentives.
Incentives. Yes, absolutely. Same thing. You simply put in, is it a annual kind of incentive, or is it a one-time, grant at the beginning of the project, and then it will include all of that in the calculations and do net present values and all that sort of financial calculations to figure out what the impact would be of those incentives. Yes.
And so on the Presidio study, Malcolm's geofires analysis did not include, for instance, the Inflation Reduction Act incentives and others. It's a very dynamic area that a year from now could be a totally different picture. So yeah, if you're doing a site-specific project, you'd want to do that as a next step, including that. But when you look at the
rules are still being written. That's the challenge.
So when you look at what Malcolm was presenting, those potential profit or loss numbers are probably the minimums. If you throw in current tax incentives, it's going to significantly improve the project going forward.
Okay. This is kind of a meaty question. Based on the EGS Earthshot target, they're targeting an LCOE for EGS, which is $45 per megawatt hour. The scenario you showed something like 120 or 220 per megawatt hour. What do you think will it take to be able to reach this level?
Yes. Ken, you want to take that, or you want me to do it?
You start, please.
Yeah. Every geothermal project, the principal expense, capital expenditure, 50% or more, is almost always the drilling. And I think the DOE Earthshot recognizes that the single biggest lever to improving the economics of the project is lowering the cost of drilling. And shout out to Fervo, who have done some remarkable improvements and have set world records now for drilling in granite at rates no one ever perceived were previously possible. Those are the kind of innovations that we're going to need. Are we going to get into drilling with lasers and microwaves and hypersonic projectiles and all of that? Yes, I think we will, as we try to get further and further down the cost curves. But the sort of off-the-shelf managed pressure drilling, temperature controlled drilling, chilled mud, those kinds of things are on the shelf and usable today. And we just need to get out and use them in the geothermal patch. It's already used in the oil patch, and I think Fervo has shown that applying them in the geothermal area is a winner to getting us down to the targets of the Earthshot.
And I'll add in a couple of things. Of course, Malcolm and I were at the launch of Earthshot. It is achievable. It's a great goal. I personally, though, don't like LCOE as a metric. It doesn't take into account intermittency, and so makes wind and solar look disproportionately favorable compared to geothermal. But the cost of geothermal is already competitive on an LCOE basis. But this whole picture of what's the price point is going to clarify very rapidly over the next couple of years, because the various technologies that are being employed are prototyping or doing their first commercial projects now. And so we'll get an initial price point on what works and what doesn't. But also don't forget, as industry gains experience, just like we did in shale fracking, that kind of stuff, you can expect an asymptotic decline in the cost of doing geothermal and geothermal drilling and engineering of your system going forward. So yeah, the price is going to fall dramatically going forward.
I will also point out this whole direct use and even electricity generation, but behind the meter, I think is the area of growth for geothermal. Grid-based, I think, will only play a smaller role than people anticipate. And one of the main reasons, and I'm just speaking now for the US, is that the price of electricity that you pay today is about 50% of it is the cost of generation. The other half of it or more now is delivery charges, is taxes, is profit, et cetera. So if you're going behind the meter and just generating electricity for yourself, in fact, the price is half of what, because you don't have to worry about transmission, delivery, et cetera. If you can make the electricity for yourself, then you are looking at really a target that is even smaller than what you're paying, from the grid operator. Now, grid operators are not going to like that you're going to stop buying from them, but that's what really will change the landscape as well for economics of behind the meter thing, is this recognition of an increasing percentage of what you pay is not going to the generation itself. And generation is where we're competing for geothermal.
Since we're in the topic of EGS and before we run out of time, I'd like to get your comments on the potential of EGS versus advanced geothermal systems versus thermal energy storage versus repurposing of oil and gas wells. Which of these do you think will be the next breakthrough technology for geothermal?
Well, yes to all. I think there's real potential for all of them to come online. It's a matter of when. And if you're saying the first, well, EGS is an incremental step out with less technology development required than, for instance, an AGS. So there might be a difference there. But coming up really, really fast now too is the energy storage and retrieval technology, and that could actually be the first to flip the switch to on in Texas among the various projects that are brewing. So, field trials have shown a better than 80% return on energy in versus energy out. And it doesn't require substantially new technology. There's a couple of companies that are working in this area to do energy storage, but you also have the added benefit of it's very rapidly scalable. When Texas was doing the shale frac boom, we were drilling 15,000 wells a year. So you've got that. And then the fact that Earth as a battery is probably a lot more environmentally friendly than massive lithium battery banks. And it's also more flexible on delivering the energy. Malcolm?
Yes, yeah, I would say yes. Where each technology works best, that's where you should use that technology. But I think it's really important, particularly for direct use, to do this geothermal anywhere thing. And so the focus should be on making geothermal anywhere possible and using the best technology where you can use it. I think that, for example, the fracking part of EGS is going to raise resistance, I think non-technical resistance in a lot of places, which will make deployment of EGS anywhere a challenge. There's several other sort of challenges around it. And if you're going to try to do it in communities, I'm involved with Rice University, for example, in the center of Houston, wants to do geothermal for heating and cooling their buildings. And there's no way the city of Houston is going to allow any fracking of any stimulation of any sort in the middle of the urban center. And so that's just an example of the kind of challenges that EGS will face. However, where it will work in rural areas where fracking is permitted, it's going to go great guns.
I think that's the perfect note to end it on. We have this whole suite of tools for geothermal, and it's just important that we try to use all of them in the appropriate setting, in the appropriate geologies. And I would like to thank Malcolm and Ken for this webinar, and also our audience. There's still about like a dozen questions here, but that's all the time we have. So thank you for the interest.
Thank you. Thank
Thank
you
you,
all.
everyone.
And for those who are asking if the webinar will be the recording will be available, it will be up on our website in like maybe 2 weeks or so. Just check on the ThinkGeoEnergy website. Okay then. So thank you, Malcolm and Ken. Thank you, everyone. That's it. Have a good weekend.
Thank you.